When faith felt like safety, people talk about faith as if it's always soft, warm, protective, something you lean on when life gets hard. No one talks enough about how dangerous faith becomes when someone decides they speak for God. I was 16 when I met him. I didn't come from a broken home. I wasn't running from drugs or crime or chaos. My life was ordinary, quiet, almost invisible. And maybe that was the problem. I was the kind of girl people rarely noticed. And when someone finally did, it felt like being seen for the first time. He didn't look holy. No white robes, no crosses, no dramatic speeches on street corners. He dressed simply, jeans, neutral colors, calm posture. His voice was low and steady, the kind that made people lean in instead of pull away. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he explained. He said the world was confused. He said churches had lost their way. He said God no longer spoke through institutions, God spoke through him. He never introduced himself as a cult leader. He never said the word Jesus right away. That came later, carefully, slowly. First, he said he was chosen, then guided, then prepared. By the time he finally said the words new Jesus, they didn't sound insane anymore. They sounded logical. Adults listen. That should have been my first warning. But when you're 16, you assume adults know what they're doing. When teachers, parents, neighbors nod along, you learn quickly that doubt is something you keep to yourself. He talked about purity. Not in the way churches usually do, not with shame or threats. He framed it as power, as clarity, as freedom from a corrupted world. He said young people were closer to God because they hadn't been ruined yet. That age wasn't weakness, it was proximity. He said some girls were chosen early. That phrase stayed with me. Chosen early. It sounded important. It sounded meaningful. It sounded like a reason for all the confusion I felt inside. For the loneliness, for the constant sense that I didn't quite belong where I was. He said obedience wasn't submission, it was trust. And trust, he said, was love. When he looked at me, he didn't look like a man looking at a girl. He looked like someone evaluating a role, a destiny. He said I had a calm soul, that God favored quiet strength, that I asked the right questions even when I didn't speak them out loud. No one had ever described me like that before. The group around him reinforced everything. They smiled when he spoke. They repeated his words as if they were scripture. They told stories about miracles, healings, signs, things you couldn't prove or disprove, things you were expected to accept. Doubt was never punished directly. It was simply labeled fear. And fear, they said, came from evil. So you learned to stop questioning. When he touched my shoulder for the first time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt ceremonial, like something sacred was happening. He said God worked through physical presence, through energy, through connection. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe I mattered. Weeks passed, then months, the rules shifted quietly. Boundaries blurred in ways I didn't know how to name. He always had an explanation ready, always wrapped in language about purpose and faith and sacrifice. When I realized I was pregnant, my mind didn't go where you'd expect. I didn't think of sex, I didn't think of biology, I didn't think of him, I thought of God. My hands were shaking when I told him. I expected anger, panic, denial. Instead, he smiled, not surprised, not afraid. Calm, he said this was what had been promised. That miracles rarely made sense at first. That history was full of young women chosen to carry something greater than themselves. He said the child was not his. He said the child was God's. And everyone around me nodded. They said I was blessed. They said this was sacred. They said doubt would only bring suffering. I was 16, pregnant, and surrounded by people telling me I was part of something divine. For a while, I believed them. At 16, it happens even faster. Your body stops belonging to you and starts belonging to opinions, whispers, expectations. In my case, it also belonged to a story I didn't fully control. They didn't call it pregnancy. They called it the sign. Every symptom became meaningful. Every discomfort was reframed as spiritual resistance. Morning sickness wasn't sickness, it was my body rejecting the old world. Exhaustion wasn't fatigue, it was transformation. Pain meant I was doing something right. I learned quickly that complaining was dangerous. Not because anyone yelled at me, not because I was threatened, but because concern was met with disappointment. Gentle disappointment, the kind that makes you feel guilty instead of afraid. He reminded me constantly that doubt was natural, but indulgent. That fear was understandable, but selfish. He said many people were watching me now, learning from me, that my strength mattered. I started measuring my thoughts. If I felt scared, I told myself it wasn't real fear. If I felt confused, I told myself confusion was weakness. If something felt wrong, I assumed the problem was me. He was always calm. That was the hardest part. He never raised his voice, never rushed, never contradicted himself openly. When someone asked a difficult question, he smiled and said, "You'll understand when the time is right." When doctors were mentioned, he said, "Faith and medicine didn't mix well." When my parents hesitated, he spoke to them privately. After those conversations, they changed. They became quieter, more careful, as if disagreeing suddenly felt risky. They didn't pull me away. They didn't confront him. They trusted that an adult who spoke so confidently about God must know something they didn't. I remember sitting in a room full of adults, all of them older than me, all of them nodding, while I sat there pregnant and silent. That was when something inside me first shifted. Not doubt yet, just isolation. As my body changed, his attention changed too. At first, he had been everywhere, watching, guiding, choosing words carefully. Now he was distant in a specific way, still present, but less focused on me as a person and more on me as a role. I wasn't me anymore. I was the vessel. He spoke more to the group than to me, more about the child than about how I felt. When I tried to talk about fear, he redirected the conversation toward purpose. When I asked practical questions, he reminded me that miracles didn't follow logic. Sometimes, late at night, I lay awake and tried to remember how this had started, tried to trace the path backward. I couldn't find the moment where I had agreed to all of this. It felt like waking up in the middle of a story and being told you'd already chosen your part. I thought about leaving. The thought came quietly, almost accidentally. And the moment it did, the guilt hit harder than any fear. Leaving meant rejecting God. Leaving meant failing. Leaving meant becoming ordinary again. I didn't know which scared me more. He sensed the shift before I ever spoke it out loud. He told me people like me were often tested, that the closer you got to truth, the stronger the temptation to run became. He warned me about outsiders, about lies, about how the world destroys what it doesn't understand. Then he said something that still echoes in my head. He said if I left, I wouldn't just be hurting myself, I would be hurting the child. Not threatening, not dramatic, just a statement. Calm, certain. After that, everyone watched me more closely. Not openly, subtly, someone always nearby, someone always checking in. Concern disguised as care, I stopped being alone. And that's when the miracle started to feel heavy. I began noticing things I hadn't before. How his rules applied differently to different people. How some chosen girls quietly disappeared from conversations. How stories about miracles never had details you could verify. How his words shifted depending on who was listening. One evening, I overheard him speaking to someone behind a closed door. The voice wasn't holy. It wasn't calm. It was impatient, sharp, irritated. That sound didn't fit the image I had built in my head. It didn't fit Jesus. It didn't fit God's voice. It fit something much smaller, much more human. That was the first real crack. Not proof, not clarity, just the realization that something didn't align. And once you notice that, you start seeing more. Once doubt enters, it doesn't rush. It waits. After that night, after hearing his voice lose its calm behind a closed door, something inside me stayed awake. I started listening differently, watching more carefully. The words were the same, but the meaning shifted. He still spoke about love, about sacrifice, about destiny, but now I noticed how often those words served him. I noticed how rarely he followed the rules he set for others, how boundaries applied strictly to us but loosely to him, how questions were praised when they led nowhere, and quietly discouraged when they came too close. The group didn't change. I did. I began asking small questions, harmless ones, practical ones, about the future, about what would happen after the birth, about responsibility. The answers became vague. He said the child would belong to the mission. He said God would provide. He said clarity would come later. Later became his favorite word. I asked if he would help raise the child. He smiled and said, fatherhood was a human concept. He said I should be careful not to reduce the divine to something ordinary. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Not fear, recognition. I realized I wasn't special. I was replaceable. What mattered wasn't me or my child, but the story he could tell through us. I started paying attention to the other girls. Some had been praised once, then quietly pushed aside. Some left suddenly, without explanations. Their names stopped being mentioned. When I asked where they were, I was told they had failed their test. Failed, as if faith were an exam you could be expelled from. I tried to talk to my parents. They looked uncomfortable, conflicted. They said they just wanted me safe. They said they didn't want to interfere with something spiritual. They said maybe I was just overwhelmed. I stopped trying. Isolation is effective when it's gentle. One afternoon, I found something I wasn't meant to see. Not a document, not evidence, just a conversation. A careless moment, words spoken without ceremony. He was angry about money, not about the mission, not about faith, about donations. He talked about control, about loyalty, about keeping people close and quiet. There was no mention of God, no mention of love, no mention of miracles, just logistics. That was when it finally became clear. Jesus wouldn't need strategy. God wouldn't need manipulation. A miracle wouldn't require silence. I confronted him, not dramatically, not loudly. I asked directly if he truly believed the child was divine. I asked if he truly believed he was chosen by God. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. The pause told me everything. Then he said I was becoming dangerous. That doubt was spreading through me, that I was letting fear corrupt something sacred. I told him I didn't believe him anymore. The room went very quiet. He didn't explode. He didn't threaten me. He looked at me with something close to annoyance, like a tool that had stopped working. He said if I left, I'd be alone. He said the world would judge me. He said no one would believe me. For the first time, those words didn't work. Because suddenly, the truth was simpler than the belief. He wasn't Jesus. He wasn't chosen. He wasn't divine. He was just a man who had learned how to use faith as a weapon. Leaving wasn't easy, not physically, emotionally. Walking away meant losing everyone at once. The group, the certainty, the meaning I built my identity around.
It meant becoming a pregnant 16-year-old girl without a story that made it holy.
But it also meant reclaiming reality. I left quietly. I was 16 when I met him. He didn't look holy. He didn't shout or threaten. He spoke calmly, confidently, and said the world was broken, that churches had failed, that God had chosen a new way to speak. Through him. At first, adults listened. That made it feel real. He talked about purity, destiny, and girls who were chosen early. He said obedience was love. That trust was faith. I was lonely and I wanted meaning. I wanted to matter. When I found out I was pregnant, he didn't panic. He smiled. He said it was a miracle. He said the child wasn't his. He said the child was God's. People around me repeated it until doubt felt like sin. Fear became weakness. Pain became proof of faith. I stopped listening to my body and started listening to him. Over time, the rules changed. His words shifted. His calm disappeared behind closed doors. He spoke about control, money, loyalty, not God. I saw how other girls were quietly erased when they stopped believing. I asked questions. He hesitated. That pause told me everything. He wasn't Jesus. He wasn't chosen. He was just a man using faith to control people. Leaving meant losing everyone. But staying meant losing myself. So I walked away, pregnant, 16, scared, and finally honest. And that truth saved me.